Europe in 1947 moved at a slower rhythm, with clocks that seemed tired and walls that wore the winter. Train sheds were chipped and cold. Queues formed before dawn for bread that arrived late, and sometimes not at all. Windows were taped, roofs were patched, and city centers held wide gaps where addresses used to be. In this uneasy calm, a proposal crossed the Atlantic that spoke of recovery through coordinated aid. American officials framed it as a practical path to stability. European leaders weighed it against thin treasuries and anxious streets. The setting is not a courtroom or a rally. It is a table scattered with draft notes, exchange rate sketches, and penciled margins that say, "If funds arrive by spring." What follows is a dramatized reconstruction that relies on public records, press bulletins, and archived minutes where available. The scenes are arranged with care, yet remain interpretive. Names appear when part of the public record. The intentions behind them are treated with caution. Numbers are used sparingly to preserve clarity and avoid false precision. The narration stays within the late 1940s and does not reach forward to later decades. It accepts that most decisions were made under pressure and with incomplete information. Some moments are inferred from schedules and itineraries that place key actors in specific rooms. Others draw from statements that could have been diplomatic in tone rather than candid. The aim is to present a usable picture of a continent trying to move cautiously from survival to recovery. The path seems straightforward on paper. In practice, it bends around shortages, party rivalries, and a new map of influence that few had measured in full. The months after mid-1947 felt suspended between exhaustion and motion. Before sunrise, workers reached silent yards where the night frost settled on rails and catwalks. Office lights came on one floor at a time. Telegraph clerks rolled ribbons, waiting for figures that would decide whether wagons left today or the next. In port cities, cranes tested their chains at first light. Harbor water slapped against hulls that carried crates stamped with familiar markings. On the pier, stevedores called out slate numbers and an accountant recorded arrival times with careful block letters. To many eyes, the crates meant flour, coal, replacement parts, and medicines. To others, they looked like a promise that might, over time, ask for something in return. Bystanders saw both readings at once. Markets reopened with narrow aisles and measured prices. Street sellers stacked tins beside small pyramids of soap. A baker turned the sign from limited to available, then crossed his arms and watched the crowd form. Families left with a little more than before. School canteens served broth that smelled better than last week. Small improvements kept tempers in check. Newspapers reported calmer nights and shorter queues. The tone was relieved but tentative. A few pages in, an editorial would mention the new aid plan in practical terms and suggest that cooperation could temper inflation. In private, some editors may have asked whether fresh supplies might blur the boundary between emergency and reliance. Their caution rarely reached the front page. Most readers wanted the timetable for deliveries, not the theory behind it. Planners at ministries tried to keep pace with the promises. They penciled in cargo totals that seemed large enough to matter, yet small enough to move. Budget sheets were copied and stacked into folders with string ties. A clerk announced that a meeting room had been reassigned to the allocation committee, and a handwritten sign went up on the door. Minutes from similar rooms would later show brisk exchanges about tonnage and priority lists, and they often concluded with the phrase, "Review next week." In working neighborhoods, relief was tangible. A tram line reconnected two districts. A coal depot met its allotment for the first time since spring. A textile mill restarted night shifts and posted a note that wages would be paid on Friday. The factory siren sounded sharper than usual, and a group of children counted the blasts. In farms outside town, a lorry brought sacks that promised a better harvest. A farmer stood with his hat off and watched the driver sign the receipt. These details looked simple, but they changed the tempo of each day. People spoke more quickly at counters. Shop shutters stayed open longer. Letters to relatives carried a softer tone, as if the page itself had warmed. Yet under the progress sat a ledger that did not close. Hardware would need a second shipment. Grain would need a reserve. Fuel allocations overlapped with municipal plans that had drifted during the winter. Each fix created fresh dependencies and pushed decisions into corridors where visitors waited with briefcases and measured smiles. The dynamic was not hidden. It was discussed in cabinet sessions that balanced aid against policy autonomy. Archive items from those sessions, where available, show members asking how to accept help without redrawing the line of control. The wording stays neutral. The concern feels restrained yet steady. Citizens were not briefed on the steps behind the scenes. They measured the day by the arrival of bread, the warmth of a flat, and the sound of machines that had slept through the war. Many accepted the official frame because it delivered relief at a bearable price. Others read the fine print and kept a private list of conditions that might arrive later. The plan's public face was cooperative, even modest. Its internal face involved schedules, purchase orders, and exchange protocols that linked cities to an external source of strength. Neither picture was wrong. Both were incomplete. As winter approached, the necessity of coordination became less of an argument and more of a rhythm. Crates on the quay needed a calendar. Factories needed a sequence. Customs officers needed guidance that would keep the lines moving. Press bulletins began to include standardized language about cooperation outcomes, and these brief notes, often a paragraph long, set expectations for the week ahead. For the ordinary reader, they were reassuring because they were plain. For the attentive reader, they hinted at an arrangement that might, with time, shape choices in other rooms. The day usually ended with a power cut avoided and a warehouse closed on time. It was enough to repeat tomorrow. Menace added a second item. Streets sounded less hollow at night. The memory of air raid sirens remained, but it stood one step further back in the mind. Most people would have accepted that change without argument. The crates kept coming. The ledgers grew thicker. The tone of city life lifted by 1 degree. From the quay and the market stall, the view turns inward to a set of crowded tables in Paris, where draft agendas for coordinating aid are placed in order, and initials are penciled beside each line. The meeting rooms were not grand. They were tidy and slightly cramped, with windows that opened a fraction and radiators that clicked in the morning. Delegations arrived in pairs and took seats that had been assigned. Handshakes were brief, jackets were kept on, and documents were stacked by topic. A senior official set a packet on the table, then leaned back and waited for the chair to begin. The language stayed neutral. The stakes did not. Europe needed an agreed method to channel the promised aid so that shortages would narrow and the currency shocks would not multiply. The approach relied on coordination that several states found unfamiliar yet necessary. Each brought a different memory of the past decade, and each guarded a different set of priorities. The early sessions moved through statements of position. Representatives from hard-hit regions described energy deficits and transport bottlenecks in concrete terms. Colleagues from larger economies spoke of credit, balance of payments, and the pacing of imports. The minutes captured the tone with simple verbs: proposes, notes, requests, defers. These records, preserved in part, read like careful steps on a narrow path. Press communiques following the sessions remained sparse and calm. They named the venue, noted progress on frameworks, and signaled a next date. Behind the short lines were longer drafts and crossed-out phrases. Coordinated procurement and distribution looked clean on a chart. It looked far less clean once politics entered. The column marked conditions. Some governments feared public anger if conditions became too visible. Others feared drift if conditions were left too vague. The compromise evolved by inches. Delegates compared priorities for coal, foodstuffs, and industrial inputs. They argued over which sectors deserved early emphasis. Their voices rarely rose. The pressure showed in the number of times a session paused for consultation. The map in the corner told another story. Interest from eastern capitals faded as outside pressure mounted. Draft letters that had expressed a willingness to study the plan were not followed by travel. A chair left one nameplate on the table for a day, then removed it. The absence changed the mood. With fewer seats, the room felt more aligned on paper and more divided across the continent. One official raised the point that a two-speed recovery might harden political lines. No one challenged the remark. It simply sat in the minutes beside a new paragraph on customs coordination. Economic planners tried to keep the conversation inside the ledger. They presented tables that compared estimated needs to shipping schedules. The numbers were rounded and deliberately conservative. A technical subcommittee proposed a mechanism for monitoring delivery and usage. The draft avoided intrusive wording and stressed shared responsibility. Several delegates called it workable. One asked whether the mechanism would drift into surveillance. The chair replied that oversight was essential for credibility. The record shows agreement, with one reservation entered for the file. The method that emerged would later be cited as a model for discreet supervision. It relied not on dramatic inspections, but on regular reporting that aligned with existing ministries. That design reduced friction and preserved the tone of partnership. It also signaled that aid could be withheld if the reports did not arrive. That part did not reach the communiqué. The session stretched toward evening. Ashtrays filled slowly. Coffee arrived in small cups. Translation was steady and exact. Draft language moved from should to will in crucial lines about currency discipline and import preferences. Delegates requested time for instruction from their capitals. Messages traveled overnight. The next morning, the room returned to the previous sentence and made two changes that placed the burden across all parties. The balance was careful. It tried to ease domestic debates while keeping the plan intact. The pressure on leaders at home intensified. Parliamentary caucuses asked what promises had been made. Editors sought a phrase that could be printed without fueling unrest. The answer was usually procedural. It sounded dull by design. Outside the conference, a small crowd waited at the steps and asked for a sign that power cuts would lighten. A spokesman said a schedule would be posted next week. No more detail was offered. Inside, the agenda turned to procurement. Lists were ranked. Ports were assigned provisional volumes. Insurance, warehousing, and rail priorities were mapped to existing capacities. A technician warned that 2 lines could not handle the expected traffic. The remark was entered into the annex and marked for review. The most sensitive point hovered at the edge of the table: how to keep the assistance from turning into open political confrontation. No one declared a doctrine. They framed the risk in pragmatic language and kept their comments brief. A few phrases in the notes hint at a belief that stability could be defended through growth. Another line mentions the need for democratic legitimacy. The words may have been chosen as much for their calming effect as for their accuracy. By the close of the week, several working formulas stood in place. They were not elegant. They were operational. Delegates shook hands in the corridor. A staff member collected folders in a leather bag and walked them to a quiet office 2 floors up. There, the outlines hardened into schedules that would push steel, grain, and spare parts through routes that had only half recovered. The first communiques for the public went out that night, and their restrained tone did its job. The speakers did not promise too much. They promised next steps. Nada serupa muncul di ruang Kementerian Ekonomi saat daftar cek alokasi dan jadwal kapal mulai dibuka satu persatu untuk ditransfer ke pabrik dan sawah. The shift whistle before dawn cut through the cold and told workers that the line would move today. Foremen watched the lamps blink on and checked the board that mapped each station. The early months of implementation demanded a steady rhythm rather than grand gestures. Allocations from the coordination rooms became consignments with simple labels and destination codes. Trucks rolled past brick walls marked by old blast scars. Warehouse doors opened and closed without fuss. On the floor, a machinist unwrapped a part that matched the damaged gear on his bench. A riveter warmed her hands and took the next frame. In break rooms, conversation sounded lighter, with cautious humor about the extra shift announced for Friday. The supply chain felt short, but it held. The shop ledger that tracked hours and output grew thicker and more legible. That quiet order had a price in attention and restraint. The guidance from ministries came in circulars that asked firms to follow purchase plans, pay within set windows, and report inventories at regular intervals. Managers found the tone firm yet practical. Compliance kept shipments coming. Deviations risked a pause they could not afford. A few grumbled that the rules flattened local initiative. Others replied that discipline avoided shortages that once turned small delays into a full stop. In nearby fields, tractors pulled across frozen soil to test repairs before spring planting. Cooperative boards discussed seed and fuel with voices that rose only when memories of last year's yield entered the room. The new season had to be better, even if the path to better was not fully theirs to draw. Local officials checked rail timetables and tried to keep promises that had been printed on posters. Anxious households measured the change in onions and bread. A grandmother told a child that warmer rooms meant the town was waking up. She did not add the part about budgets and exchange rates because she did not need to. The plan's public meaning lived in the pantry and the pay packet. Its private meaning lived in the arrangements that touched currency, preference lists, and the placement of advisors. Workers knew the public meaning. Managers knew both. The press reported improvements with a steady cadence, using words like steadier, calmer, and resumed. Editors chose photographs that showed movement rather than triumph. A crane mid-lift, a shopkeeper writing a receipt, a warehouse with the door open and light slanting across the floor. The story did not need gloss. It needed proof that could be seen on a weekday morning. The background rhythm continued in rooms without cameras. A policy desk compared import drafts to balance sheets. The person at that desk knew the danger of mistakes that could ripple into prices by the next month. The ledger showed inflows that matched what had been agreed. The outflow tab held more variables. A colleague suggested staggering one order to test the rails. The edit was small and careful. If one reads the available circulars and price notices, a pattern appears. Adjustments were made in short steps with close attention to public mood. Price bulletins came on predictable days to signal that the state was watching. Where unrest had been sharp in spring, the bulletins named fewer commodities and kept the text plain. Calm language served as a cushion. Political rooms read the same indicators and steered their debates accordingly. Speeches praised cooperation and credited domestic effort first as a point of pride. Critics warned of new obligations, but some softened their tone as voters found work and heat. The center of gravity moved toward those who could explain policy without stirring fear. That did not end suspicion. It placed it on a slower burn. In unions, meetings ran longer. Delegates argued that wages should rise with output. They carried resolutions that noted living costs and asked for a fair share. Employers pointed to imported inputs and narrow margins. The ministry proposed staged adjustments to avoid a wave of claims that could pull the timetable apart. The exchanges stayed intense, but rarely broke. That persistence spoke to the sense that the plan, whatever its layers, could not be thrown aside without cost. One can see in scattered minutes of labor boards and cabinet committees the same posture, responsibility framed as prudence, and prudence framed as the shortest route to a normal week. In districts where aid was not taken, a different rhythm held. Ration cards kept their sharp edges. Street corners stayed crowded as dusk fell. Families sent letters westward that asked about prices, light, and noise at night. Replies came back with careful phrasing, as if the writer feared that too much good news might sound disloyal. The divide no longer sat on a map alone. It lived inside households that compared news clippings and waited for the future to declare itself. Advisors from abroad, labeled as technical, found office space near key ministries. They reviewed reports and offered comments in margins. Some suggestions read like common sense. Others leaned toward alignment with wider trade patterns. Local staff used what they needed and set aside the rest. The habit of saying noted without commitment became part of the language of survival. The working rule remained plain. Keep the power on, keep the rails clear, keep the shops supplied. Each success bought an extra week of political patience. The mistakes were small, but the room for error was smaller. In a port city, a bottleneck forced a delay, and papers criticized planning for 2 days. The next convoy landed at a quieter quay, and the story faded. Such episodes accumulated without becoming a crisis, which was itself a measure of how far coordination had come. By late 1948, the texture of life had changed enough to be felt but not yet named. Neighbors borrowed less and paid in cash more often. Weddings grew in size, then shrank when coal allocations dipped. Schools added hours on cold days when the heating worked. These small markers gave the policy a human clock. They also gave it leverage. A government that could deliver rhythm could ask for trust. A government that failed would see its coalition thin. The plan paused in none of these scenes. It sat at the edge of each table in the form of delivery notes, import priorities, and progress charts that were plain enough to understand. Its strength was not drama, it was repetition and the visible tempering of scarcity. Toward the year's end, factory managers posted new schedules with a column for training younger workers who had not known the pre-war output. The line moved at a speed that felt attainable. Foremen spoke of maintenance as if it were a strategy. The tone remained practical and unadorned. There was no speech that could compete with a payday that arrived on time. From shop floors and county boards, fokus berpindah ke ruang sidang dan kampanye musim berikutnya. Saat rancangan anggaran diperdebatkan dan poster mulai menautkan perbaikan harian dengan janji politik yang semakin spesifik. Campaign placards appeared first on tram stops and market walls, with lines that promised reliable heat, fuller shelves, and steady work. The phrasing felt measured rather than fiery, as if candidates understood that voters trusted calm plans over loud appeals. Party organizers walked neighborhoods with notebooks that tracked bread prices, tram punctuality, and clinic hours. Their brief visits produced lists that fed into stump speeches framed by pragmatic claims. The connection between aid and domestic policy did not need explanation in these streets. People mapped it through their routines and carried that map into the voting booth. Inside parliaments, the budget season opened with long benches, clipped speech, and stacks of estimates, heavy enough to bend the wood. Ministers defended allocations that linked imported inputs to promised outputs. Opponents asked whether conditions, if any, narrowed room for future choices. The exchange stayed within procedural language, but the names of line items carried subtexts understood by anyone who read newspapers closely. Price notices posted on municipal boards became reference points in debate. A lower figure on a staple supplied talking points for leaflets printed overnight. A higher figure forced a press appearance where a minister pointed to delivery schedules and advised patience. Minutes from committee hearings where accessible suggest that cross-party agreements formed around core sectors. Energy, transport, and food processing held a priority status that overshadowed other rivalries. A few clauses dealing with currency discipline drew more cautious discussion. Members asked whether the measures would constrain wage settlements or public works. The chair often returned the conversation to supply stability and framed the rest as technical detail to be refined in subcommittees. In union halls, organizers pinned announcements about bargaining calendars next to notices on safety checks. The tone of meetings shifted as overtime became normal in several plants. Delegates argued over how much of the new output should flow to wages, training, and maintenance. They compared notes from 2 or 3 factories and tried to anchor claims in verifiable changes rather than general sentiment. The discipline of the shop floor influenced the discipline of the hall. Employers arrived with thinner files than the previous year, but their pages read clearer. Inputs had landed, orders held. Margins remained narrow. The shared understanding that a fragile rhythm had formed kept disputes intense but contained. Campaign strategists sensed this mood and adjusted language. They spoke of partnership without dramatics, and they credited domestic effort first. The foreign element of assistance remained present, but was phrased as a scaffolding rather than a structure. On corners where critics distributed broadsides that warned of loss of control, the counterargument came from the bakery window and the factory gate. Bread and wages did not settle the matter, but they softened it. Press coverage reflected the same balance. Editorials praised improvements, but maintained a tone of watchfulness. Reporters relied on 2 sources in particular. One was published budget annexes that outlined program costs and import categories. The other was communique from coordination bodies that listed delivery milestones in short form. These artifacts kept the public conversation close to testable claims. They also limited room for grand interpretations which suited a public that valued predictability over drama. In districts where acceptance of aid had been partial or contested, rallies ran noisier. Speakers leaned on language about sovereignty and warned that administrative forms might harden into obligations. Yet when these rallies ended, attendees often lined up for ration updates and ticketed train schedules. Daily needs kept positions fluid. Local administrators learned to hold two ideas at once. They could guard pride in decision-making while acknowledging that without the supplies on the siding, pride would have to face a cold room. The campaign therefore pivoted to municipal competence. Candidates promised better warehousing, tighter theft prevention, and fewer delays in customs. The pledge was modest yet powerful because it touched the point where policy met the handcart. Parliamentary arithmetic evolved as crowds listened for a tone rather than a theory. Coalitions formed around those who could pass a budget that kept the timetable moving. A small party might trade a vote for a clinic extension or a rural rail spur. The compromises read local, even when tied to larger frameworks. This grounded the national conversation and reduced the fear of remote control. It did not remove suspicion. It placed it in a drawer that people opened only when a delivery failed. Advisors, often labeled technical, attended committee sessions and sat quietly with folders. Their interventions were brief. A footnote here on inventory swings, a sentence there on staggered tenders. Their comments, recorded in some annexes, suggest a preference for routines that aligned with wider trade patterns. Civil servants copied what fit and left the rest. The practice of choosing without fanfare became a civic habit. As ballots approached, posters switched from abstract talk to concrete pledges. Streetlights on this block by winter, a second tram on that route by November, a market roof repaired before rains. These promises could be checked in the first week after the vote, which made them both risky and genuine. Party leaders accepted the risk because the rhythm of recovery rewarded those who tied claims to timetables. When results arrived, majorities were thin but serviceable. Governments resumed with ministers who had learned the cadence of cautious progress. Their first act was to reissue the program's calendar in terms the public understood: shipment windows, power hours, market days. The reset felt mundane. It was also strategic. It kept debate inside a frame where performance could be measured on a Thursday morning rather than in a pamphlet. In opposition benches, voices that favored slower integration pressed for more transparency on conditions. They asked for publication of oversight mechanisms in plain language. Chairs agreed to limited releases, which satisfied few but diffused tension. The practice of publishing short, steady summaries became part of governance. Whether by design or by necessity, it taught audiences to watch the next week rather than the distant horizon. Toward the end of the season, campaign symbols came down from walls and city crews peeled glue from bricks. Voters moved back to ordinary tasks with a slightly firmer step. The delicate balance held, in part because it was never described as settled. Public statements continued to name near-term aims and acknowledge that disruptions might occur. This kept expectations within reach and prevented a burst of frustration when a train was late or a market ran short of onions. The story, for now, continued in accounting rooms and rail yards rather than in rallies. Menus stayed a little broader, homes a little warmer, tempers a little shorter when schedules slipped. The narrative remained practical and close to the ground. Menjelang the next budget review, attention shifts to eastern capitals and border stations, where absence from the plan becomes a daily condition that reshapes routes, prices, and the language of official bulletins. Freight cars idled at a junction where two systems met and parted. On one side, manifests referenced consignments tied to coordination schedules. On the other, clerks worked with ration tallies and requisitions that stretched from 1 month into the next. The contrast at these border stations was not theatrical. It was procedural. One queue moved with documents people had learned to trust. The other paused for checks that grew longer each week. Station masters kept their faces composed as lines lengthened. The formal reasons given were ordinary: weight limits, copy errors, inspection windows. The underlying reason was less simple. A decision taken months earlier in distant ministries had turned into a daily geography that redrew habits and expectations. In cities that stood outside the aid framework, shop windows filled more slowly. Households saved fuel with stricter rules. Factory output rose in bursts and sagged when parts did not arrive. Newspapers reported achievements with pride and warned of hurdles with careful understatement. Editorial language emphasized self-reliance and vigilance. Readers accepted the tone because they had little choice. Yet letters that crossed private networks told a more varied picture. A cousin in a western town wrote that trams ran later than before and that the library had reopened 2 afternoons a week. The reply came with warmth, but also with restraint, as if too much good news might feel like a breach of courtesy. In university halls, debates about economic models and national direction lasted late into the evening. Lecturers cited production figures and compared them to pre-war baselines. Students argued over whether planned priorities could meet immediate needs without external assistance. The conversation moved between theory and the timetable of the next coal delivery. Outside, posters announced youth campaigns for repairs and harvest drives. Participation was high. The campaigns built cohesion and carried a sense of shared purpose. They also masked deeper strains. When a machine sat idle for lack of a bearing, the pause could not be filled with slogans. Industrial boards met to discuss bottlenecks and issued instructions to spread scarce inputs across more plants. The goal was coverage rather than speed. The policy carried moral weight, yet it slowed the recovery curve in ways that workers felt by midweek and managers recorded in weekly summaries. Public bulletins used neutral phrases to describe these delays and promised review. Across the divide, coordination offices posted lists that assigned shipments to factories by code. The logic did not look heroic. It looked methodical. Deliveries did not erase inequality or end local disputes. They did reduce the chance that a minor shortfall would become a shutdown. Press items credited municipal crews for handling flows with minimal loss. The praise was small and exact. It served as a lesson for districts still deciding whether to copy some routines without acknowledging their origin. Advisors in eastern capitals, tasked with proving that internal plans could match external resources, designed schemes that relied on cadre discipline and targeted mobilizations. The plans worked in areas with strong cadres and clear chains of command. They faltered in sectors where spare parts could not be manufactured on schedule. The strain showed first in transport and later in food processing. When shortages peaked, shops limited hours and schools shifted afternoon classes earlier to save light. These adjustments made headlines only when they overlapped with holidays. The management of perception became as complex as the management of freight. Inside border offices, conversations remained quiet. A customs officer stamped a document and returned it through the window with a polite nod. The official posture avoided open confrontation. The practical effect was delay. Truck drivers learned which lanes moved at certain hours and which officials accepted documents in a preferred format. The folklore of survival adapted with remarkable speed. Families scheduled trips around rumored inspection windows. Merchants planned stock days that compressed lines and eased resentment. The rules were written far away. The workarounds were local and nimble. In this environment, the idea of Europe as a single marketplace receded into speeches and returned as a series of precise routines that differed from town to town. Communique from ministers, whether east or west, emphasized order. Two types of order emerged. One was the order of lists and timetables supported by regular external supplies. The other was the order of campaigns and requisitions sustained by discipline and internal redistribution. Both sought stability. Both built legitimacy. Each produced a different daily rhythm that citizens could feel in the weight of a shopping bag and the temperature of a room at night. Reports from border security occasionally mentioned propaganda leaflets and rumor circuits. The tone stayed factual. The real messages moved not on paper, but in parcels. A tin of condensed milk carried news of a sister's wedding. A packet of seeds carried advice about soil. These small exchanges did not change policy. They softened it by keeping families connected. Where local authorities tolerated such parcels, the mood stayed manageable. Where they cracked down, tension rose in ways that forced extra patrols and more posters reminding citizens of priorities. Cabinet notes from several capitals, when available, include short entries on public mood. These entries reference market attendance and factory absenteeism. They read like weather reports and were treated accordingly. A rise in absenteeism triggered a factory visit. A dip in market attendance prompted an extra consignment to a district. In this sense, Both systems practiced a form of feedback that tied policy to a visible signal. The difference lay in the source of relief. One had a warehouse list with international origins. The other had a mobilization ledger with local names. By late 1948 and into 1949, border towns learned to live with this twin logic. Hotels kept 2 reservation books. One depended on visits by planners and inspectors. The other depended on traders who navigated rules with a precise sense of timing. Many residents grew fluent in both. The tide of coordination and control met in the same cafes, where cups were counted and sugar measured. Nothing about these scenes felt dramatic to those present. It felt like a set of workarounds made durable by repetition. As schedules stiffened, patrol timetables expanded and routes shifted to quieter gates at night. The traffic never stopped. It changed shape. From checkpoint ledgers and household budgets, the focus moves to ministerial corridors and advisory desks in Western capitals, where oversight tools, reporting habits, and currency discipline begin to settle into a repeatable pattern. Corridors outside finance ministries held a steady traffic of clerks with wire baskets. Doors had small plates with unit names that signaled a new phase of reconstruction. Not the thrill of first shipments, but the calibration of rules that kept them meaningful. A modest oversight office collected monthly reports from firms that received critical inputs. The format fit local habits, which helped compliance. A ledger column asked for quantities used. Another asked for output achieved. The numbers were rounded, and not every section lined up, but the trend lines could be read without demanding intrusive visits. This reporting habit mattered as much as any single shipment because it furnished a map for currency policy. Prices had to stay within a band that citizens could tolerate and that governments could finance. The band was kept with plain tools, tax collection sharpened, procurement staggered, and credit access was guided by circulars that discouraged speculative hoarding. None of this drew crowds to squares. It showed up in the quiet way shopkeepers set price tags and in the confidence with which workers planned for a weekend purchase. Public communication followed the same pattern. Press notes issued at regular intervals listed 3 items: arrivals by category, progress on transport backlogs, and the next review date. The brevity signaled control without pretense. The notes anchored expectations and reduced rumor. In the background, exchange rules shifted a fraction at a time. The goal was not perfection. It was continuity. Advisors viewed the currency desk as a hinge between foreign supply and domestic legitimacy. The hinge had to be oiled with predictability. If the public sensed swings, trust would drain into panic buying. If firms sensed uncertainty, inventories would expand to the wrong places. Minutes from small working groups where they survive show a consensus for incrementalism. They name risks and then propose narrow steps that distribute the burden across sectors. The language is careful and sometimes dull. That dullness serves a purpose. It slows the spiral of expectation that can outrun policy. On factory floors, the effect of these adjustments appeared as marginal shifts in payroll envelopes and procurement orders. Managers could live with thin margins if they did not have to rewrite plans every 10 days. Unions pushed for clauses that tied wage review to observed improvements rather than to promised ones. The compromise specified dates and referenced 2 indicators that both sides trusted: posted price bulletins and production logs. When these indicators moved, talks resumed. No one pretended that the numbers captured every strain. They captured enough to sustain a pattern of bargaining that kept output moving. In rural districts, credit committees linked seed orders to projected harvest windows. They avoided the promise of dramatic increases and aimed instead at avoiding shortfalls. Radios carried short farm advisories that matched rail schedules for inputs. The detail seemed ordinary. It made the difference between a missed sowing and a passable season. As reliability grew, municipalities revived projects that signaled normalcy: repairs to school roofs, tram refurbishments, a cinema restored to weekend operation. None of these works proved the wisdom of any large plan. They proved that a public calendar could exist again. From the perspective of households, this was the clearest proof available anywhere. The political effect was not a wave of gratitude. It was a slow return of patience. In this climate, oversight remained both necessary and delicate. Inspectors arrived by appointment and kept visits short. They asked for ledgers, checked seals, and signed in a small book by the door. Firms took pride in neat records because neat records kept the routine invisible. On occasion, a visit produced a warning and a reduction in next month's allocation. These incidents were not publicized. They circulated as cautionary tales across a few streets and guided behavior more efficiently than any speech. A second current flowed alongside oversight, the question of orientation. Trade lists and purchase patterns nudged states toward certain suppliers. This did not have to be framed as strategy to function as one. Over time, the pattern of parts and spares trained technicians, purchasing agents, and even school curricula to match a set of standards. The public saw this only in small ways. A machine adopted at one plant led technical schools to adjust lessons. The adjustment tied the next group of workers to a supply chain that could be described as open, but was, in practice, guided. None of this required declarations. It required calendars and receipts. In eastern districts, where internal plans carried the load, currency questions were resolved through rationing formulas and state prices that pursued internal balance. The store felt different. Lines moved in bursts. A new consignment cleared shelves in an afternoon. Then the room returned to its patient hum. Policy learned to anticipate that swing. The rhythm became part of daily psychology in a way that westward routines did not share. Both paths were tiring. Both trained citizens in different kinds of waiting. The divide hardened without anyone needing to name it in speeches. When leaders did speak about it, they did so in phrases that used nouns like security, cooperation, or vigilance. These words kept channels open for future agreements, even as networks set in place. By the end of 1949, observers noted that strikes were fewer in districts where schedules held, and that petitions were longer and more pointed where they did not. Governments read these signals and adjusted. The plan's administrators focused on bottlenecks that still produced sharp local pain: coal grades for specific furnaces, rail spares for mountain routes, spare cots for hospitals that had reopened. Each fix made headlines for a day and then settled into the background. The front page reserved its columns for elections, trials, and foreign visits. Recovery became the second page, and that was its own sign of progress. The calendar for the next quarter listed reviews of trade protocols and an extension of reporting templates to mid-sized firms. These steps suggested that reconstruction had moved from emergency to system. Whether the system would become permanent or yield to something lighter was not declared. It was left to practice and to the next set of negotiations that would address defense commitments and cross-border guarantees. From these corridors and counting rooms, the story moves toward the diplomatic tables where cooperation turns into alignment and where the language of aid begins to share the page with the language of security. The late 1940s close without ceremony. Calendars turn, rail cars move, and office windows glow at the same hour they did last week. Street noise thickens on Saturdays and thins on Mondays. People sense that the emergency has loosened its grip, yet they also know that the routines of recovery have settled into habits that tug gently at policy. The Marshall Plan, presented in public as coordinated help, has woven itself into purchase lists, payrolls, and shop ledgers. It has also shaped the language of meetings, where words like stability and cooperation carry shades of orientation. Source materials that survive, budget annexes prepared for debate, press communiques summarizing deliveries, and minutes from coordination desks point to a careful craft. Keep prices predictable, keep transport flowing, keep oversight quiet and regular. Across the divide, a different craft is visible in campaign schedules, factory rosters, and ration boards. Both sides try to claim the middle word of order. Both learn the cost of maintaining it when parts run short or weather turns. The public face of this era remains modest. A bakery that opens on time, a tram that stretches its route, a school that adds an afternoon class. These details do not give an answer to the larger question of why one path must outrun the other. They simply make it possible to reach next week with fewer shocks. The narrative holds here at the point where economic measures meet political lines. The next steps may involve new councils, shared commitments, and cautious language about collective defense, or they may hold to quiet routines that avoid declarations. The scene tilts toward rooms where foreign ministers review maps and compare drafts of promised guarantees. Which minutes will shape the next calendar, and which signatures will bind the timetables to pledges that reach beyond rail yards and shop floors.